Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled Sediment Modeling. This webinar is sponsored by EPA's Water Quality Modeling Work Group. My name is Jason Gilday, and I'm with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. And thank you for joining us today. So there's some logistics we need to go over to get the webinar started. First of all, we hope that you have a lot of questions. If you have any questions, please type them in the questions box on your control panel and click send. If your control panel is not showing, simply click on the small orange box with the white arrow to expand it. If you have any problems viewing the broadcast, just let us know in the questions box and we will post an answer in that same box. A phone number is also available on your control panel if you are having trouble hearing audio through your computer speakers. This webinar will be archived for later viewing on EPA's Water Quality Modeling Workgroup page, and we will provide a link to that archive at the end of the webinar, and also in an email that you will receive tomorrow. Also, at the end of today's webinar, you will be able to obtain a certificate of attendance for participating, and we'll provide directions for downloading it at that time. The materials in this webinar have been reviewed by US EPA staff for technical accuracy. However, the views of the speakers are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of EPA. Mention of commercial enterprises, products, or publications does not mean that US EPA endorses them. So now that we got some of the housekeeping items out of the way, let me advance a slide and talk about the webinar purpose real quick. This webinar series is brought to you by EPA's Water Quality Modeling Workgroup. We're a group of EPA staff members at EPA headquarters and throughout the regions who use models to solve water quality problems, mostly in the TMDL and standards programs. Our group was formed as kind of grassroots efforts, really, to facilitate collaboration among EPA staff who use models. The purpose of this webinar series is to help water quality professionals better understand water quality modeling and how models can be used to solve the problems facing water quality regulators. The target audience for the series is a water quality professional who may use, want to use, or review models as part of their job, but who do not necessarily have a modeling background. As such, we're assuming that the audience has a basic understanding of water quality science and concepts, but has limited direct modeling experience. To reiterate from previous installments in this series, there's a wide range of topics to discuss with water quality modeling, and this series is presented as a broad overview or intro. The webinars will build off of each other, so I encourage people to watch the first 6 webinars if you can. All of the past webinars have been recorded, archived, and posted to EPA's YouTube website. The first 6 webinars are currently posted, and a link is available on the website, which again will be available at the end of today's webinar and via an email. So to quickly go over the webinar series topics, today's webinar is the 7th in our series, and builds upon the information presented in the first 6 webinars. The webinar series was constructed to begin with modeling basics, which was webinars 1 through 3, and then move into more specialized modeling topics. Your feedback on the series and the content has helped to shape each installment of the series. The last webinar covered various aspects of nutrient water quality modeling, focusing more closely on nutrient modeling in relation to various water body categories, including rivers and streams, lakes and reservoirs, and finally estuaries. Today's webinar will discuss sediment modeling, including various modeling tools and approaches for sediments, different endpoints for sediment modeling, case studies, and different sediment source types. The 8th webinar in our series is scheduled to also cover sediment water quality modeling, but in more detail, so please be on the lookout for the advertisements for that webinar. One final note before we kick off the presentations, we'll try to answer as many questions as possible if you've been on these before. I will moderate the questions as you're typing them in. We do have a pause in the middle of the presentation today to do questions and answers, and then we'll do that again at the end. So please type in your questions as you think of them, and then we'll get to them at the question and answer period. So a quick recap of the webinars so far. The first 3 presented a basic modeling overview and covered conceptual topics such as what is a model, why do you use one, the types of models available to use, and how to select a model. The 4th webinar started to get in more detailed case studies with temperature modeling with Qual2K, and the last 2 webinars were more focused on nutrient modeling. Today's webinar, again, is going to be on sediment modeling, And with that, let me introduce Dr. Ron Bingner from the USDA Agricultural Research Service National Sedimentation Laboratory. He'll be presenting today. I'm really excited to have Ron. He's one of our national experts in sediment modeling, and also to expand our modeling webinars to include agencies outside of EPA and guest speakers to help talk about modeling and expand our breadth of knowledge. So Dr. Bingner has been an agriculture engineer at the USDA National Sedimentation Laboratory in Oxford, Mississippi since 1986. His current research activities involve the ARS leadership for development of the continuous version of the Agricultural Non-Point Source Pollution Model and AGNPS, or ANN-AGNPS, in cooperation with USDA and NRCS. His research has been used in the evaluation of conservation management practices needed in controlling erosion on watersheds throughout the U.S. and internationally. And Dr. Bingner, he received a BS and a PhD from in agriculture engineering from the University of Illinois and an MS in agricultural engineering from the University of Kentucky. And with that, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Ron to get us going today.
Thank you, Jason. I'm really excited to participate in your webinar series and to talk about some of the modeling tools we've developed in ARS and with other agencies. And so sort of the background of what I'd like to talk about is just kind of give an overview of some of the tools we have and approaches for looking at sediment and sediment modeling, and look at different reasons why we use sediment modeling through some examples. And then really to start out with, start talking about some of the different sources of sediment that we try and capture in our models and which model might be better to use in certain circumstances. Just a quick overview, if you're not familiar with ARS, we are the principal research agency of USDA, and we have a ARS water quality research program that looks on studying the movement of water and sediment and other chemicals in the landscape. And so we're looking at improving our understanding of those processes to develop models, develop practices, technologies that can improve our agricultural water resources. And so within our water quality program, that's resulted in a large number of process-based models. And it's developed for a range of scales and conditions that are of interest to agriculture as well as other interests. I'm going to focus on just erosion today and sediment and give you some brief background on what we look at in terms of how do we put together models to capture those processes that are important to our watershed systems and to our production for our agriculture economics. Our general definition of erosion has been around for a while, but it's really just the process of detachment and transport of these soil particles by erosive agents, typically water or wind. And in a water sense, our erosive agents are raindrop impact or the actual flow of water over the surface. And so as part of that erosion, there's detachment of those particles from the soil surface. Those particles get added to the sediment load and transported downstream by the water. And so when we're looking at detachment coming from the soil, it can be a number of particles that are transported, or it can be transported as aggregates. But at some point downstream, there's typically deposition of the coarse material, and that will reduce the load. It adds to the mass of the soil that's to be deposited on, and it can be because of roughness, it can be because of rows, and it can be because of practices that encourage deposition, such as filter strips, terraces. And so where that deposition occurs is often part of the simulation, but is difficult to simulate because often we don't understand a lot of the deposition processes of individual particles. So often that's a lumped process that we'll incorporate into our model. Generally, when we talk about erosion, we have many types of erosion, and going from interrill and rill, which is more commonly labeled sheet and rill erosion, wind erosion, ephemeral gully erosion, the classical gully erosion, which would be at the edge of fields, erosion in channels, or mass movement or geologic. I'm not going to cover wind or mass movement or geologic. We do have a ARS research facility that does study wind erosion. That may be another later webinar. And I'm not going to talk much about the permanent incised gullies. Our technology often is not capable of looking at those kind of complex processes, and we do have a need to improve our technology for those edge of field classical gully conditions. And so when we look at erosion, we try to understand why studying soil erosion is important. And this figure illustrates that as the thickness of the soil increases, our yield, in this case corn, increases. And so having a thicker soil can result in higher yield. Erosion reduces that thickness, produces thinner soils, and thus less yield. And so what we're really concerned is, can we keep up our agricultural production and meeting our food demand? And when we look at the next 30 to 40 years, we can see that there is a great demand for food that's anticipated that exceeds what we would have produced over the course of the last 500 years. And so maintaining that productivity is critical. And we also know that as time goes on, we have a lot of land that converts from agricultural conditions to urban conditions. So we're also losing our prime farmland to urban conditions, and it's been estimated upwards of 7% up to 2030 will lose in addition to where we're at now. And our other concern is, if we're going to erode soil, how fast can nature replace soil? And so looking at some studies around the world at how quickly soil reforms, we've come to sort of a 0.24 tons per acre per year estimate that does say that soil does replace itself, but our typical allowable soil erosion standards allow 3 to 5 tons per acre. And so if we're eroding 3 to 5 tons but only replacing a quarter ton, we know then that soil depths are not growing fast enough to replace the eroded soil, but then allows us to be extremely productive. When we look at erosion around the world, we can see that there are areas that are highly concentrated erosion areas, and certainly in the United States we can see that areas that we understand to be highly erodible are displayed, but there are even areas of the world that are even higher erosion rates, particularly because of gullies, channel erosion. And so a lot of the processes and models that we apply in the U.S. can be applied internationally. One of the difficulties in applying these models internationally is that the databases aren't always as sufficient as what we might have in the U.S. When we look at the U.S. in terms of where wind and water erosion occurs, and this is looking at 1982, where wind is the red, water is the blue, we can see that the Midwest dominates the water erosion along with the Mississippi River Valley. As time has gone on to 2007, because of conservation practices, that wind and water erosion has decreased. Now our estimates for that erosion from water is typically from sheet and rill erosion. Doesn't include channels or gullies, but from sheet and rill erosion, we can see that as time has gone on, those contributions for erosion has decreased. We don't have a very good handle on is how much of the other source of the sediment has decreased with time. We have a little limited information on ephemeral gully erosion from around the United States, but our estimates can range from 15 to over 50% of sediment coming from our watersheds as a result of ephemeral gully erosion. And when we look at international sites, it's a similar aspect where we see from various countries that have data upwards of over 50%, and in some cases all the erosion comes from gully erosion. When we look at fields and we try and characterize where erosion is on a field, we look at raindrop and overland flow producing the sheet and roll erosion that then flows into concentrated flow that then can be termed ephemeral gully erosion. But all those sediments are transported to some point at the downstream end of the field or later in the channel. And so when we look at the watershed, we can see that erosion problems can occur anywhere. And we try and develop our tools to account for those erosion sources anywhere in the watershed as well. And so they can, of course, it can occur in fields. And these small channels that are transporting sediment can also erode the soils. And in larger stream systems, we can have a highly degraded system as well. When we look at channel sources, there's a few studies that have given us indication of how much comes from channels, how much comes from surface conditions. And so from some of the watersheds around the U.S., we can have a majority of the sediments come from channel sources. And so if we're looking at a watershed approach of assessing sediments, trying to capture all those sources is critical to coming up with what is the best practice to apply to address the sources that are causing the problems. When we look at these practices, we have what I labeled different types of controls. In terms of erosion control, that might be at the field level. Sediment yield control would be at the edge of field. And sediment load control, which would be downstream of the field into the channel, into other water bodies. And so those are all really connected by the sediment transported through the system. And for erosion control in the field and residue management, typically would be the biggest bang for the buck if you can apply residue. And typically no-till is a way that we've encouraged producers to increase the residue by reducing the amount of tillage that occurs. Sediment yield control, as the water transports the sediment from the field into systems, we often adopt edge of field filters. Could be repairing buffers. And then when we get into gullies, which are still in the field, grass waterways would be a typical practice that we would encourage producers to implement. As the sediment transports downstream off these fields into channels, we would then look at other control measures that could be implemented, grade control, bank protection, stream meander restoration. Is the hope. Not much I see goes on with stream meander restoration. When we look at the models, we often have to consider the scale we want to apply the models to, because some models are better suited for certain scales, small scale to river scale. And so, but as we increase our scale, we often increase our complexity, that we have to consider more processes. And so that often requires more data to enter into those models as well. That's basically a background of the processes that I wanted to cover before we start talking about models, so that there's sort of a even keel in where we're at and what I discuss later. So Jason, if you want to field questions, this would be a time to do that.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. Let me just take a second to remind folks we've got several questions submitted so far, but if you have anything else, please go ahead and type them in at any time. If you're referring to a specific point on a specific slide rather than something that's more broad in your question, if you could indicate the slide number or provide a few more specifics, that would help as I try and facilitate and moderate the questions for Ron. So with that, Ron, I'm just going to kind of start going down the list if you're ready.
I'm ready.
I think right at the beginning you might have used a phrase called row middles, or maybe we misunderstood you, and the question was, are you referring to agricultural crop rows?
Generally, I would have referred to agricultural row crops, which would have been furrow-driven.
Okay. Another question on the slide where you talked about the rate at which soil is eroding versus the rate at which it's kind of being replenished. Does 0.24 tons per acre per year of soil development refer to a specific land use or geologic area, or is it kind of an average of everything, or what is it based on?
Well, it's based on a general regeneration of soil within the fields, and that can be because you have your residue breaks down into soil organics. It can be because you have deposition, maybe your wind. We have a lot of soils that are built from wind deposition of sediment that's blown off the plain soils. So there's a number of particles that are in the atmosphere that still settle out that contributes to the growth of the soils.
And a follow-up question on that same slide, were those numbers based only on croplands, or did they kind of average or include things like forest lands?
Mainly cropland, but it did cover many other types of surface conditions. I'd have to go back and review what the conditions were, but there were some, you can have a soil growth in depositional areas like floodplains that could be faster than in other areas that are from other sources. So, but in a general average, that's the best that we could discover.
Great, thanks. You presented an erosion map that showed wind erosion versus, I think it was water erosion, with a lot of different dots in red and blue. On that map, where there were no dots, what is kind of the question is, what does the white color mean? Is it no data or no significant erosion or other?
Probably no significant erosion because of maybe forest land, urban areas, areas that just in rocky areas. It's just information that wasn't producing erosion to the point that produced a dot.
Okay. And then we have a question about erosion from construction sites, and I don't know if you touched on that, but the question is, what is the general percentage of sediment that originates from construction versus agriculture versus channels?
Well, construction sites certainly are a major source of sediment at the time that they're working on those construction sites. Usually it's a temporary and a time scale basis, but during that time when they're producing those sediments, it can be a significant problem to the system. Those are site-specific, short-term, generally in our time scales we look at in terms of 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. We'll discuss a little bit of modeling techniques that are available for construction sites later in the webinar.
Then you had a graph comparing in-stream sources of sediment to terrestrial sources. And the question is, were those primarily agricultural watersheds that were compared in that example?
They were primarily mixed land use watersheds, but probably predominantly agriculture. One of the difficulties in getting that assessment is using a lot of ways to capture the sources, usually radionuclides. And so probably dominated by agriculture, but maybe in some cases 25% agriculture, in some cases maybe 90% agriculture.
Okay, and I think maybe the final question we'll have time for now. How do you go about determining where the source of the sediment is coming from, or if it's rill or gully or stream?
Well, we have some various research techniques that we can use, and that can be using flumes strategically located in a location that you're measuring the sediment in various scales as it's transported downstream. We've looked at using radionuclides. A lot of the atomic bomb testing that occurred in the 50s deposited a lot of nuclear material that can be used to measure surface sediments at that time that are transported downstream. And there's some other materials that can be put onto fields, and then when the sediment erodes, we can measure those amendments that are applied to fields. Those techniques are often expensive, time-consuming, and often we don't have much of those. So the other ways to doing that would be topographically. If you have very good detailed elevation maps that can look at the degradation of surfaces, you can look at that with time and kind of get an estimate of where the erosion was, where the sediment went to is not so easy then to determine.
Great, thanks, Ron. I think there's a few more questions. I think we should probably get moving on. We might have time to come back to a few at the end. And one logistics issue, Ron, there's a few folks that are having a little trouble hearing you. So if you could do whatever you can to speak up and get closer to the mic, that would be appreciated. Thanks.
Okay, sure. My voice will certainly get quieter as I keep speaking, so I'll make a note to keep up the volume. Okay, Jason, I guess to continue, what I was going to start discussing was some of the different erosion type models that have been developed and are typically used by various agencies. But probably the flavor will be mostly on agriculture, but the processes are similar in other types of conditions. And so for sheet and rill erosion modeling, we are looking at something that's been around for 60 or 70 years as USLE in one form or another. This is generally meant for plot or field scale analysis, and really the background on USLE is it's really an empirical-based equation that was derived from natural runoff plots, and some of the literature that kind of led up to the final release of USLE in 1978 with the Agricultural Handbook 537 is a technology that is a genesis for a lot of the models that we still use. Even as we try and understand process-based models, application of USLE is still important to make assessments of sediment loads. And so, as most of you probably are familiar with USLE, it's really a simple equation that incorporates a lot of the climate, soil management, and topography issues that could occur in a field. And so, coming up with those parameters has been a process over the last 50 years within ARS to populate those kind of parameters. One of our difficulties now is that in ARS and university-wide, we don't have many USLE plots. In fact, we probably don't have any USLE plots that are capturing information to capture new practices that might be available. Often rely on models to assess those new practices. And so when we look at the landscape that USLE would look at, typically field scale, looking at overland flow, inter-rill, and rill erosion, but really the USLE captures a concept of flow path, slope profiles, that doesn't include ephemeral gully erosion. As time has gone on, the USLE was revised to incorporate more components, more process-based equations that can capture some of the conditions that we'd see into the plots. And so adding on to that kind of technology is some of the literature that's shown here that leads up to the release of Russell 2. And Russell 2 has been used in construction sites. There is a manual for surface mines and construction sites that is available for Russell 2. And it's often been used in those kind of scenarios with databases that are targeted for those kind of practices in those locations. Russell 2 is still used as a management planning tool by NRCS, and it's meant to be reliable, provide acceptable results, and it's really based on these 10,000 plot years of data that provides the strength of the technology. New features have been incorporated and developed in Russell 2 to expand its capabilities in different areas. And so what Russell 2 provides is to look at overland flow and how soil erosion is produced from sheet and rill sources, but also adds a sediment yield component in terms of hill slope profiles by calculating the deposition on particle sizes down that hill slope. So Russell 2 again is used for conservation planning. It's meant to help protect the soil, against the erosive soil erosion that can occur, and also evaluate how sediment leaves the site. And so local conservationists, particularly NRCS at district levels, would apply Russell 2, working with landowners to come up with a plan for their site-specific conditions. And Russell 2 is used worldwide, including by many agencies, consultants, federal agencies. And so when we're looking at Russell 2, applications can occur in cropland as well as forest land, rangelands, and so on. One of the factors that Russell considers, again, is the climate, soil topography, and land use. If Russell 2 produces erosion and some sediment yield data, we also look at sediment yield models to expand what we could get from Russell and USLE. And so there was a modified USLE that was developed to create a lumped estimate of the sediment produced from these erosion sources in the field, mussel. And so mussel essentially incorporates runoff and peak runoff rate components to replace the R factor of the USLE to come up with the sediment delivery ratio. And this is typically the approach used in the SWAT model and other models like APEX to come up with an estimate of sediment leaving the field. But if we wanted to be able to separate out sources in a field and just look at sheet and rill erosion and then look at other components to assess ephemeral gully erosion, there's some other tools that can be used to look at that. And so a similar type of equation looking at runoff and peak runoff developed only for sheet and rill erosion is technology that we've adopted in NAGNEPS to then link with ephemeral gully erosion sources. When we talk about sediment from gullies, it's particularly from ephemeral gullies, we can characterize those gullies in terms of three different types. One would be ephemeral, another is edge of field, and a less common one that we look at is valley trenching. And I won't talk much about valley trenching, but ephemeral gullies are typically a disturbance of the surface by tillage, or a result of that, and the erosion that occurs from that concentrated flow. Edge of field gullies are generally at the boundary of fields and channels, where flow leaves the field, enters the channel, but causes a head cut or some other disturbance to move back into a field. And then valley trenching is essentially if there's a disturbance in the downstream system. It could be mining, it could be construction, other reasons. We see valley trenching a lot, maybe downstream of reservoir dams, because of you remove the sediment source entering that channel, the water still wants to erode transport the sediment, then it erodes the channel. If we look at gullies, one of our difficulties in modeling is coming up with a definition that we can use analytically in the models. We have technology that says where sheet and rill erosion is. We have technology that tells us where a gully is, but we don't have technology that tells us where one ends and one starts. And so we're looking at gullies in terms of understanding the processes. Again, looking at where they begin and where they end. Our other issue may be because we can't see gullies very well because of the vegetation covering. And so in this image we can clearly see a ephemeral gully with a incision with a head cut that's upstream. In that same area, as the vegetation has grown, we no longer see the gully. And so trying to quantify visually ephemeral gully is often as difficult because we can't see it very well. And then just the understanding of gullies can occur in many forms in terms of flatland areas. We can still have gullies. Often they're wide and shallow. In other areas, they can be narrow and deep. It can be based on soil. It can be based on the cover conditions, topography. Some gullies are very complex, maybe branching in many areas. We can have gullies that form inside of other gullies. And so coming up with technology that characterizes those different types of gullies is difficult. There's some international gullies, a gully that's on a steep area. In this case, it looks like the road of equipment that went up is a path for the channel flow. And then after the crops are harvested, the farmers will go fill those gullies in. This is just a closer look at those olive orchard areas. When we're talking about gullies and repairing gullies, repair of gullies will fill in the channel, but then the next flow event will transport that sediment in the gully. And so just to give you an idea of how that process of repairing the gully would occur, this is just a series of images showing a tractor pulling some implements that are tilling the field. And so we have a gully in the middle of the field. The equipment is moving back and forth, essentially filling in that gully until the next event that then transports that sediment in the gully. So when we're talking about concentrated flow, erosion, forming ephemeral gullies, this is an ephemeral gully that's being filled by agricultural implements. And so, again, gullies waiting to be eroded in the next event. Again, it's another image before tillage with a gully that's forming. After tillage, to educate people about gullies, it's often difficult because those gullies may only be there for a short time that's visible, and maybe months before there's another event that would produce erosion for that gully. Where those gullies form can be anywhere that the conditions are right, so it doesn't have to be the edge of the field, it can be upstream of the field. Understanding where those initiation points are is important in modeling. We may have not just one head cut forming in that gully, it can be a series of head cuts. And so understanding those processes are critical to capture in a model. And even what we might think tillage, no tillage would control gullies. It may control the filling of gullies, but we still have gullies in no-till fields. And so this is just a series of images that show those gullies forming in no-till fields. And because tillage often produces a non-erodible layer below the implements that reduces the depth that gullies would form, in a no-till field, we wouldn't have that sort of non-erodible layer because of tillage, so the gullies often are deeper in no-till fields. And so we have a few models that are available for us to look at for gully erosion. EGEM is a model that's been around for 20 years that incorporates some of the concepts of the processes of gullies, but really is a standalone without interaction of flow models and sediment transport downstream. Some other models that have incorporated in looking at tillage-induced or with Russell II and the gully erosion estimator are some of the current tools that are available. So when we look at watershed modeling, it's often for a different purpose. And typically for developing watershed plans to look at what is the best approach to reduce the sediment, but also provide the maximum economic benefits. So we use watershed models as an aid, not the only decision tool in developing plans, but as an aid to that decision planner. And so when we look at management plans, we'll see a decision that has to be made where to place practices, but also which practice to place. And so in this image, we can see cover crops, we can see grass waterways. If we replace buffers, we often would place those along the pathway of the concentrated flow. If we were to place no-till, it could help reduce some of these sheet and rill erosion sources that are in this image. One of our issues in developing our watershed simulations is just defining what is our system. Is it defined based on watershed boundaries and flow paths? Characterizing watersheds based on the elevation, soils, land use, and climate, often GIS gives us that capability to characterize those in a easy fashion, but we still have a need for improved databases, particularly for management and for elevation. Several states have a complete coverage of LIDAR, some states minor coverage. Locating where to place practices is often a management decision that is in consultation with either the conservationist and the producer, but there may be a group that has been established to help implement practices in a watershed. Understanding where those gauging stations are that can help calibrate models is helpful. And then finding ways to capture watershed data into a model is a challenge. So when we look at, again, when we're looking at watersheds, and the terms I look at for models is we're looking at a single outlet. There may be conditions in coastal areas where you may have multiple outlets that occur. You may have braided systems. Those are more difficult to assess in a lot of the watershed modeling technology. The easiest is defining a watershed boundary where you have a single outlet. And then linking the technology, such as what I'll describe more later, that can systematically integrate the evaluation of those practices as the sediment may move downstream. Focused on anagnips, it's been a tool that's available since the 80s to evaluate the effect of conservation practices. Looking at integrated watershed management planning. Is it better to use sheet and rill erosion with no-till combined with edge of field buffers and then maybe downstream wetlands instead of implementing a more evasive approach throughout the watershed? We use Russell II science within anagnips, and then the ability then to track those pollutants from their source, so we can identify downstream where the source is coming, where the source produced that sediment at that point. So then we know if that source is producing this much sediment, we can then come up with practices that can help minimize those sources. And again, looking at femoral gully erosion within this model. And so Again, looking at those different sources of sediment, particularly for use by NRCS, but EPA, USGS, Corps of Engineers, as well as other universities we work with. And so when we look at watershed erosion, again, sheet and road erosion, ephemeral gully erosion, classical gully erosion, some channel erosion, and then the technology that can be used to assess those different types of erosion sources. I'll talk about concepts in CCHE 1D in a little bit. Again, when we look at loadings, we look at the type of loadings, how water begins, but generally models look at particle sizes in terms of 5 particle sizes: clay, silt, and sand, and then the small and large aggregates that are a combination of clay, silt, and sand. If we can keep the primary particles as aggregates, we're better able to capture the clay, silt, and sand than clay being transported by itself. So if we're going to implement repairing buffers, if we can find ways to keep the soil eroded as aggregates, we're better able to use our filters to capture those clay particles, and then chemicals as well. Again, AgNEPS uses a Russell landscape to kind of characterize the erosion types. And with the landscape, it can be any amorphous shape. And so if we look at a watershed made up of individual fields or cells that are describing the landscape, that are connected to channels, routed to some outlet, and then linking those types of sources within the watershed, we can then come up with a tracking of those sources as they move through the system. And if we look at a watershed system then that is comprised of those cells linked by the channels, we can then come up with a watershed analysis. SWOT is a model used in many places for river basin scale conditions to quantify the impact of those large-scale management practices with small-scale agricultural practices in terms of sediment loads. The laboratory in Texas, with Jeff Arnold leading that effort with its website, is listed there. The Water Erosion Prediction Project is another model that's meant to replace Russell II as the erosion predictor within the USDA. And it's a process-based model that looks at a distributed approach within the watershed system to come up with an estimate of erosion sources. Some of the features of WEP is that it's looking at the non-uniform slopes. It has a database for many types of soils and crops, and it gives us this more temporal spatial estimate of soil erosion than what USLE would provide. Moving into channel erosion modeling, looking at that scale of erosion, we have a model developed in USDA called Concepts, looking at the geotechnical components that may be arising because of the bank failures, bed lowering, deposition as a result of structures, or maybe erosion because of structures. It could be particularly for dam removal. So it gives us that ability to look at the integrated impact of upland processes with channel processes and a geomorphic analysis to come up with this long-term analysis of how things change with time. It's often used in stream sediment TMDLs to come up with a good estimate of how upland components are integrated with downstream channel processes and coming up with an integrated management plan. Some other models that are, if Concepts is a stream corridor model, CCHE 1D is a stream network model that uses similar science and components, but in a network sense that has been coupled with AgNEPS and SWOT to take the loadings from fields advance the processes within the channel. One of the issues within AgNIPS is that the channel properties remain the same from event to event. It doesn't remember the conditions that are in the channel from event to event. So integrating technology like CCHE1D gives us that ability to have the channel evolve with time. Some capabilities of the model, looking at the hydraulic structures, impact on sediment that you can read there. CCA2D is a two-dimensional model that incorporates more processes, looking at analysis of river flows, non-uniform sediments that are difficult to do in a one-dimensional sense. It has applications in a lot of subcritical and supercritical flows that one-dimensional models have difficulty doing. Particularly bank erosion is an area that 2D is geared to handle very well. Three-dimensional model is another model that advances on the two-dimensional concepts of looking at even more components that could be impacting soil erosion. And so it could be different boundaries, different temperatures, different flows at different turbulent conditions, which requires a highly computational system of estimating those. Looking at very complex systems, particularly with the Corps of Engineers assessing depositional patterns in large rivers to help improve dredging patterns or plans. Some of the applications of models has been studied in a project that's called the Conservation Effects Assessment Project, SEEP, within USDA. It's a project that's over 10 years old that has looked at many locations throughout the United States and looked at models as ways to come up with assessments, but also to improve our understanding of processes. And so I'm just going to look at one location, Goodwin Creek in Mississippi, and a watershed that's monitored by the National Sedimentation Laboratory, and looking at another small sub-area of 167 hectares. And so this area is very erosive, and it's probably one of the most erosive areas in the U.S. is one of the reasons we're studying that location. And it's been determined that upwards of 3/4 of the sediment comes from channel sources. And so if we look at land use that's changed with time, particularly for the Station 14 outline in yellow, we can see that from 1980 to 2004, we've gone from a condition where there was a significant amount of cultivated area to no cultivated area. So it provides a way to assess some of the changing conditions on sediment. And often we also have climate data that gives us spatial representation of climate that's critical for models. And we've also looked at locations of gullies. And so there's a number of gullies that occur in this area that are contributing to the sediment load. So we have sheet and rill, gully, and channel sources that all occur in this area that we've monitored. And so if we look at just over the years for runoff and rainfall, we can see highly variable that's occurred. But looking at models, we're able to capture that variability. Just some statistics to show in terms of annual data. And then we look at combining those sources of sediment and looking at models. In this case, the blue line represents observed, red line is simulated, and trying to replicate those events that occur throughout the years to capture the variability that occurs. There are events that occur that are difficult to simulate that may be so severe or because of other conditions in the channel that produced more erosion than was expected. So, but being able to simulate those sources then gives us the ability, it's just a statistical analysis of that, but the ability to look at where those sources come from in the watershed And so we can then understand where the problem areas are. In this case, the previous slide was looking at total. This is looking at clay sediment. So we may want to only understand where clay sediment comes from as it's transported to the outlet. And say we really want to do analysis of, in this slide, looking at the x-axis as accumulated contributing cell area by accumulated contributing cell load. And if we want to assess, for this case, where 50% of the load comes from, we're able to come up with an assessment that 11% of the watershed produces 50% of the sediment load. And then we can use GIS to show us where in the watershed those locations are. That would give us some information to target where to place practices or understand what practices are currently being used in those locations that might contribute to those high sediment loads. Some detailed analysis, if we look at an area that had a high amount of sediment that was produced, mainly because of the cultivated area in the right part of the screen. There was, if we divide that area up into reaches and fields by divided by sub-areas, we can see that a significant amount of sediment was likely because of conventional tillage. But there also is a natural buffer downstream that can trap a lot of that sediment. And so we can also see that there's ephemeral gullies in this area. And if we want to improve our capability of reducing erosion, we can think of installing a managed buffer. And so if we look at analysis of conditions where we have, over time, suspended sediment based on no buffers, going to just having your natural buffers, and then looking at natural and managed buffers, we can see a significant decrease of those sediments, in this case for sheet and row erosion. And then we can do a similar analysis of the sediment load resulting from gully sources. And we can see that buffers also has a major effect on the impact of gully erosion. Just a quick summary of the models I've talked about in addition to some other models. There are many models that are out there. I think in later webinars there'll be a discussion of some of these other models, just so that there's a summary of technology that's available for different purposes. And then a brief summary is we're looking for technology that gives us this management practice planning approach to look at reducing sediment from many sources while also providing this economic benefit to the producer. And our sediment models are designed to provide that information to these conservationists in making these erosion control management planning decisions. That's the completion of my webinar, and appreciate the opportunity to talk with you, and if there are questions I can answer those now.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. And we're just going to take a second for a technical transfer back over to me. Yeah, big thanks to Dr. Ron Bingner. I really appreciate your presentation today. I think that was great and gave us a great overview of all the sediment modeling options and some of the in-depth things that are going on out there. So we have another list of questions here for you if you're ready. Again, I'm just going to start going down the list. I encourage people to keep typing in questions. We do have a little extra time today since we wrapped up the presentation a little bit early. So with that, I think I'll just start in on the questions. So going back to kind of the beginning, you talked about erosion being at a higher rate than sediment growth or regeneration. I think the question is, all this sediment that's getting eroded away, where does it get carried to and deposited to, and is that counted in soil growth somewhere else?
Well, generally it's not counted in soil growth somewhere else unless we include it in terms of floodplain and deposition in those soils like that. This was generally not that kind of analysis in terms of flood deposition. It's a number that needs more analysis. It's a general estimate that our erosion is occurring faster than the ability to reproduce the soil profile. And if we're going to look at sustaining our productivity, we need to find ways to maintain the profiles in a way that's still productive.
Thanks, Ron. And I'll leave Ron's contact information, which you see on your screen here in front of you. If we don't get to a question that you've asked today, please shoot Ron an email. I'm hoping he'll have time to respond to a few of you. And with that, I'll try and get through the rest of them today. But you can also email me, Jason Gilday, at any time. You should have my contact information on the invite that you had to this webinar today. So I'm going to keep going. With all the Ron, with all the Russell Mussel USLE kind of models, is there been a look at climate change and kind of evaluating what you're going to do with those models in the wake of upcoming climate change?
Well, we have looked at climate change with models and looking at different climate change, particularly in the weather scenarios. One of our issues, though, is a lot of the parameters that we have in USLE, Russell, are long-term based input parameters, such as the C factor, often is based on long-term studies. So if we're looking at applying those same models to climate change scenarios, how do we then account for those parameters that were collected 50 years ago to apply those in the future? And so it's a challenge to a lot of the modelers to make sure that we're also changing a lot of the input parameters that could be changing with climate issues too.
Great, thanks. A question about Russell 2, kind of a specific use of it. Is Russell 2 used in pipeline development or other projects, or can you maybe describe a little more kind of the uses and where you would and where you wouldn't use Russell 2?
Russell 2 is predominantly used in agricultural situations to assess conservation practices and what would be the appropriate practice for that producer. But it has been developed and applied in mining situations. There's some user guides for surface mining applications, and there are some guidelines in surface mines that you have to reclaim it to a certain level. It's a simple tool for that purpose. Construction sites is another application that can be evaluated if you have the input parameters that describe those conditions. Often it's a very simple analysis, not looking at maybe a long-term, or individual event kind of assessment. So if you're looking at, like you have a hurricane that came through and produced 10 inches of rain, it may be very difficult for Russell to assess that. You'd have to understand the erosion, the amount of energy in that rainfall, and so there are some. Is best suited for long-term analysis of comparing practices from another practice, and it's meant to be standardized so that when you apply Russell 2 in one state, it's comparable to maybe different conditions in another state, but the technology is the same, so you come up with consistent answers that are comparable across all boundaries. That's a quick response, I guess.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's quite a bit of documentation out there on Russell 2, correct, that people could refer to. Is that all on the ARS website?
There is a if you did a Google search for Russell 2, there is a website, I don't remember, I think I had it in one of the slides, but if you had trouble, I think you can find it. It's a site that's released from Purdue University, is where that's maintained. But there also is there's an ARS version that I'm not remembering the website for that, but if you need it, we can provide that information to you.
Thanks. I'm going to take a minute and advance a slide or two. I think. There we go. Just to do a little more logistics as we're wrapping up here. We will have time for a few more questions, but right now, before you drop off, there is a certificate and archive of this webinar today. Their certificate link is provided on the slide in front of you, and will be the link. You don't have to write this down. I realize it's long. The link will be emailed out in an email to everyone registered for this webinar tomorrow. And then also the archives of all of our webinars are on the link provided at the bottom of the page you see here. Note that this website did change. EPA just migrated over to a new web system, and if you haven't noticed it, most of the links on the EPA websites have changed. So this is the link to our new modeling website. It's the same information as it was before, just a new name. And with that, I'll leave this up for a second in case anyone does want to jot down things, but go back to a few more questions. Question about flows and valley trenching. If you increase flows from improved upland drainage, does that cause valley trenching, and do you know any studies or models that have considered this?
Well, we know flows upstream can increase downstream erosion if they're not protected. So if you have a system downstream that is natural and you have a release of water that maybe is clean water, doesn't contain any sediment, the tendency, its capacity to carry sediment is great. So you can cause problems downstream that in areas that may be susceptible to those. So coming up with modeling technology, some of the technology I described does look at those simulation of those aspects, but identifying the locations is still something that's required by the analysis of that. You have to identify channel cross-sections, channel characteristics, looking at implementing practices that you may want to implement to control that erosion. The Corps of Engineers has spent a lot of energy, and I don't know if you have a later webinar on the Corps of Engineers models, the HEC models that have looked at some of those channel capabilities of their technology to assess those kind of processes.
Yeah, we actually haven't had a webinar yet. I'm thinking in the next sediment webinar we will talk a little about the HEC models, and that's actually a very timely topic because a question came up about that. Just in terms of, I think the question is which channel models are compatible with U.S. Army Corps models, and maybe I'd even ask, in terms of the uplands models and some of the in-channel models, how does all that link together in your experience?
Well, the concepts model is linked to the HEC models. Like the same inputs for the HEC model is used for the concepts model. So there's an attempt to try and link models that have development from different agencies for different purposes. There are various modeling groups, interagency modeling groups, that are looking into doing a better job of linking the models so that there is a common set of databases and processes. It's not, each agency has a different objective, and so models are often developed differently to meet those objectives, but the processes are the same. And so trying to make sure that we can not duplicate our efforts at least as minimal as we can, is a challenge. The linkage of models is something that's probably not easy to find. I don't know. Usually, it's most models are developed based on extracting the science that are common between models, and so the science is probably what links the models more than the actual code or the output of models.
Great, thanks. There's been a few questions on BMPs and models. I'm going to try and summarize. I think what folks are getting at from several questions here are, how, in terms of something like Russell or Muscle USLE, how do you incorporate BMPs if you're doing things like that? And then maybe expand that to something more like concepts or agnips.
Well, Russell is looking at BMPs that are agricultural based in terms of, it could be more for management practices. So if we're looking at reduced tillage, which could be instead of conventional tillage where you're plowing and tilling, now you don't plow, you just till. And so then you have to maybe apply more chemicals to kill the vegetation that the deep plowing would have normally done. And so looking at the impact of those practices is what USLE and Russell gives you the capability to look at. Then trying to move that impact of that practice downstream would be what's important for looking at other models like channel models, like concepts. So concepts would give you the capability to look at not just as sediment transports downstream, does it get deposited in a channel or erode in the channel, but if you're implementing a drop structure in a channel, would that drop structure be effective at the location you're trying to put the practice in? Or do you need to put many drop structures to really have an impact on the sediment that's being transported and eroded in that system? So the models that I described of agnips, Russell 2, and concepts are linked in that way to kind of capture this integrated approach of looking at practices and then trying to address the sources of those of erosion and implementing any conservation plan that is efficient and as beneficial to the watershed objectives. And it may be, it's not always agriculture, it could be reducing loads into a reservoir to reduce the cost to clean the water for drinking water. It could be another use. Linking a lake water quality model with other models is something that's has been done, but there's not like a model that flows through all the processes generally in a way that is linked in an easy application fashion.
Great. The questions keep pouring in, so Ron, if you don't mind, we'll keep going through them if people want to stick around. Maybe I'll advance one slide. Let's see here. Just another public service announcement. We are going to do another sediment modeling webinar where I'm hoping to talk more about some case-specific sediment modeling, sort of like we did with the nutrient webinars. Working on getting that put together. Don't have a date or specific list of people yet, so check back soon on our website. Also, anyone registered today will get an email regarding when this webinar is going to occur. So back to the question and answers. A good question about methods used to measure sediment loads. You talked about the modeling of them. How about the measurement side of things? How do you go about measuring, sediment in a stream or lake, I guess, or coming off a field and in the different types? It might be bed load or turbidity suspended sediments.
Well, it's not my expertise, but I do know enough to maybe give a brief answer on that. And we have a number of gauges that are meant to measure sediment, but we have maybe flumes that are capturing runoff and sediment to be able to get the load that's coming through that point. We can measure turbidity to give us an estimate of the sediment that's coming through that point. One of the other difficulties is in channels is assessing what's suspended and what's being transported in the bed, which is often difficult to measure. Measuring bed load is only a few places are capable of doing that, and it requires a lot of intensive measurements because of the bed load changes with time. You may have sand, gravel, large particles. It can be a particular concern in the west, in the more steeper slope regions where you have larger particles that are being transported as bed load to come up with that sediment estimate. USGS has spent a lot of effort to set up the gauging networks throughout the U.S. to come up with that kind of sediment estimate. Maybe you'll have a webinar on instrumentation, but certainly there's a cost involved in making a decision on what instrumentation you're going to utilize. We had a lot of effort maybe 50 years ago where we had more resources to hire more people to physically go out and do measurements into channels, either grab samples or taking continuous measurements at a point. But our resources have dwindled with time, and so we often have to rely on technology to give us an answer. And then the technology has its own issues in collecting the data. So the data that we collect now may have a different uncertainty that we would have had years ago when we had a more hands-on approach of collecting sediment. So when we're using measured data, we have our errors that go with collecting measured data and uncertainties as part of that. So when we're using models with measured data, I think you probably had something that earlier webinar that talked about calibration, validation, and uncertainty. And so coming up with that assessment of how the quality of observed data versus the quality of simulated data, hopefully your error bars overlap enough to give you confidence that your capabilities of the model are matching the observed. But it's certainly a challenge in our era of limited resources. I was mentioned a few more advanced technology that's being developed in terms of sediment measurements. Acoustics is an approach that we'd like to be able to develop, that we can use acoustic sensors to listen for the movement of sediment or measure sediment. Military invests a lot into acoustic technology. Spin-offs from that may be able to give us ways that we can measure sediment. Measuring sediment in terms of sources is a challenge because we don't often have enough data in a watershed to tell us where all the sources come from. Hopefully maybe satellite imagery can give us some more information about the landscape and how maybe topography-wise, or maybe sediment reflection, or things that are beyond what we're at today to assess that could be happening in the future. We have improved imagery technology that can be handheld, and I would hope in the future we come up with a device that's like a smartphone that you're pointing at a location, and then you're able to come up with a assessment of what's changed from the last time you took a picture of that area to see how much sediment's removed.
Thanks. ready for another question. You kind of presented a laundry list of different sediment models, and the question is, do you have an opinion on the best models related to kind of calculating sediment loads from a watershed? And I'm guessing in a lot of the TMDL work that we do, and probably a lot of the people on this webinar, you're looking at mass sediment loads, perhaps from a large watershed. And how would you recommend going about doing that of all the things you've listed so far today?
So one of the issues is, what is your objective in your watershed that you're trying to assess? And so if you're looking for a quick answer, then you need technology that can give you a quick results. And so finding the answer to your question is difficult, because we have to know a little bit more about your watershed situation. So then it comes down to understanding the level of models that are available to assess the conditions you're trying to evaluate. If trying to pick a model, general models that are usually, if you have a system that's very difficult to assess, simple models are better than complex models, because then you don't have to collect as much data that may be difficult to insert into a model. And so if you have limited information about your watershed, then the simpler the model is, likely the better the answer you're going to get. For large-scale systems, then you have to look at what processes are you also wanting to include. On a large-scale system, you then start encompassing base flow, groundwater conditions, maybe reservoir releases that are hard to schedule. And so often we have to lump a lot of those parameters. So a large-scale model such as SWOT that encompass a lot of those processes in a simple way that gives you an answer. But if you have sources of sediment that are not included in those models, such as gully erosion, and that's a significant source in your watershed, trying to integrate those capabilities into those watershed models, you may have to come up with something like ANAGNEPS or Russell II. There's a number of approaches that I've seen in EPA where they take the USLE model and simulate all the fields at a USLE scale, but then route those loads using the sediment delivery ratio to some downstream point. And so there's a lot of those kind of simple approaches I've seen in TMDLs. But it often limits, in terms of USLE only being a long-term average annual approach. If you have individual events, if you're going to look at climate change, it may be difficult to apply USLE for those conditions. So I guess there's a lot of caveats to when you would pick the model that's right for you. We spent a lot of time in the last 20 years coming up with literature that gives a background on different models for different uses. But a lot of times the application of the model that's best for you is the one that you're familiar with, the one that you're able to understand and grasp the input parameters. But if you're also able to assess the limitation of those models so that you can honestly answer what you think the results are providing you. So I know there's a lot of literature on models and when you apply those that are better suited than I can provide.
Yep, we've definitely stressed that throughout our modeling webinar series. Understand your tools, understand your problems, and then pick the right tool to address the problem. So appreciate that answer. So kind of following up on that then, so we have a question. Say you're a small watershed association trying to do some of this stuff, and perhaps you don't have a lot of expertise in these areas. Do you have some recommendations on where to find help, either a person or a website or an agency?
Well, I have had experience working with associations and the cooperatives, and often the the cooperatives provide a way to interact between the producer, an agency, and often maybe the urban issues that may occur. And so often it takes a to develop those kind of cooperatives requires relationships that everyone can trust, would provide benefits that are not just to the favorite son kind of thing, but it can be targeted to where the problems really are occurring. And so for USDA technology, your FSA office, your NRCS person that's there can be the first source. There's an NRCS office in every district in the United States. There's also state offices in NRCS that has expertise that can direct you to the appropriate technology. Sometimes you don't need to apply a watershed model. There may be just a simple lookup table that gives the information that is acceptable for the purpose you're trying to resolve. In other agencies, there's also technical support centers that I'm sure can be a source of information. For soil properties, in USDA we do have a soil survey center that has a website that you can download all the soil properties you can think of. One of our limitations is capturing the management that occurs out into watershed with changing time, changing practices. When do you plant, when do you harvest, when you till? Knowing when that actually occurs is often, we use typical values that are representative of that kind of practice. But if you're looking in a calibration validation sense, you need to look at actual conditions. And so working with your, maybe a watershed manager, soil water associations may have a director that you can communicate with that can point you in a direction. It may be a expert consultant. It could be one of the things that NRCS is trying to incorporate is consultants doing some of the analysis that are paid by farmers in assessing the practices for different funding reasons to get cost sharing and things. So there may be a number of people out there that can provide advice on that kind of aspect.
And then following up on that, I know a lot of the larger national models like SWOT or HSPF or C=W2 have these, national training events. You can go to their website and, either download a training or actually attend one that's, maybe yearly or every other year or something. For the question is for the ARS or the USDA models like concepts or AgNIPS or even just using Russell and Muscle, are there trainings that you guys put on that that people can attend, or a website to a webinar on a training on a specific model, or is that something you've even considered?
Well, there are websites that provide information on training, like maybe training materials that we've produced. Generally, for Russell 2, there was likely more training in the past than there is now. But there's a lot of training materials that are available at their websites. The training often is ad hoc as needed for a lot of the models. Since the models are developed by researchers, often the priorities are not to provide training so much, but if you're working with action agencies, and SWOT has worked with action agencies that are able to support that kind of training. But there are a number of, if you were to contact the individuals that are responsible for that kind of technology, they, like for me, I'd provide individual training. If someone comes for a day or two, we can work through a lot of the issues that they may be concerned. We do have some targeted workshops that may occur. There's like with conferences, there may be a workshop like a pre-conference workshop that is associated with those kind of models. Advertising that, I guess, is just to be aware of the websites for those technologies and looking for any kind of information that provides a heads up on that. So I guess it's a vigilance on the user to find that kind of training in terms of dealing with research models that are developed as applied models. Often requires an action agency to really take that to that training level.
Great, thanks. And I think with that, why don't we get wrapped up here? I think we've probably talked Ron hoarse now. Again, I just advanced the slide with our link to our modeling website. Encourage people to check back often for announcements and the posting of this webinar. Also, after you exit the webinar today, you'll see a survey. We really take these survey results seriously. As I've said in the past, we read through every answer and we use your survey results to plan how we're going to have additional webinars and what topics we're going to have in the future. So please take a minute to fill those out if you can. And with that, Ron, just a huge thank you from all of us for presenting today. Great presentation. We got lots of postings in the questions and answers that were literally statements that said, fantastic presentation, please give Ron a big thanks. So thought I'd pass that on. And to everyone out there, thank you for joining us today. And we're going to end the webinar now and hope to have you back on our next one. Thank you.